The First Total War by David Bell. So a few years ago, I had this idea that I was going to go back to school to study European history. I never did. That's a different story for a different video. But the point being, I decided to put together a little reading study list for myself while I was thinking about the idea. And what I did is when I was back in my hometown, I went into one of the local colleges there and went into their bookstore. And you can buy books from the college bookstore whether you're enrolled as a student or not. So I just looked through what books were assigned reading for the history students, and this was one of the books on the assigned reading list. So I thought I'd buy it and give it a read, and yeah, here I am with the review. So, if nothing else, this is a very ambitious book. The author has clearly bitten off a lot to chew on here. In his 20-page introduction, David Bell outlines the multiple interrelated themes of the book and the many various assertions he seeks to prove. Bell is attempting to trace the development of modern attitudes towards war. He believes that both the attitude of modern doves, who believe that war is wrong, and that of modern hawks, who believe that war is necessary when combating a great evil, both of these views come from the history of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. You see, before the French Revolution, war and military life was considered a normal part of existence, and a constant state of warfare was considered the norm for European kings and the military aristocracy. As a result, argues Bell, 16th and 17th century warfare was, some exceptions aside, relatively restrained and limited. It was a gentleman's game in which you played by gentlemen's rules. During the Enlightenment, for the first time, moral criticism of war appeared in mainstream intellectual thought. And this eventually culminated in the French Revolution and the Revolutionary Assembly's formal declaration rejecting war. Ironically, the same French Revolution led Europe into the 20 years of the bloodiest warfare it had ever seen. Now, Bell is counting the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars as all part of one of the same long war, and that's where he gets that 20 years of war. However, because after the French Revolution, intellectual currents were against the war as a normal course of politics, it was now necessary for both sides to justify this war as a necessary evil leading to a greater peace. It also became necessary to completely demonize the enemy so that the gentleman's code on the battlefield no longer existed. But instead, horrible atrocities were committed on both sides as part of what they viewed as the final apocalyptic war. In his introduction and conclusion, Bell goes on to draw parallels with our modern age and suggests that the way we view war now is a result of the intellectual upheavals in the Enlightenment. For example, Bell makes several parallels between the war to end all wars rhetoric of World War I and the same belief during the French Revolution. In both cases, soldiers believed they were fighting one final apocalyptic battle in order to bring about an era of world peace. Bell also attributes our tendency to describe the enemy of the moment in terms of absolute evil to the same intellectual history. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of balls being juggled here. And at times, the thread of the book is in danger of being lost among all the different layers of arguments. And I have my doubts about whether Bell has successfully proven everything he set out to prove. But then, this book is not written as an academic thesis, as Bell makes clear in his introduction. Quote, "I have written the First Total War for general readers, not only fellow historians. I have therefore tried, as much as possible, to embed my arguments in sketches and stories, rather than in analysis alone. If these qualities make the book something other than the definitive, exhaustive pronouncement on the subject, so be it. End quote. And if the book is judged purely by the standards of proving all of its assertions, then I have my doubts. Now, again, I'm no expert here, but the thing that I had the biggest reservations about is his idea that war was largely a gentleman's game before the French Revolution, right? Because there was some nasty stuff that went on in the religious wars in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. And Bell does acknowledge that. He has a whole bunch of caveats when he's making his main thesis, but I guess the thing that lingered in the back of my mind was, okay, how many caveats can you add up here before the thesis falls apart? I'm not an expert by any means, but that was just the lingering doubt that I had while reading this. So I'm not sure he's proved everything he wants to prove. But that aside, if you're just looking for a book that's going to give you a lot to think about, good food for thought to chew on for a while, then this is a fascinating book. The first couple chapters are a bit of a mess, and this is what I was talking about before. Bell is trying to show how pre-modern attitudes about war were different from the modern era. But it's filled with so many exceptions, caveats, and counterexamples that I almost got a little bit dizzy trying to figure out what he was saying exactly. But once the book gets to the French Revolution, then the narrative really takes off. Now, Bell spends a lot of time talking about the horrific French Civil War in Vendée. Now, this is actually the same ground that Victor Hugo covered in the novel 93, which I've also reviewed on this channel. And in fact, Bell actually quotes a lot from Victor Hugo's book 93. However, Bell gives a different perspective to the conflict than Hugo. Both of them portray the war as horrible, but Hugo shows how man's noble nature rises out of that horror. However, reading David Bell, the reader gets a much more depressing view of human nature, as he gives example after example of terrible atrocities committed by both sides. The conservatives, but also the enlightened Republicans. Now, as Bell promised in his introduction, his history is liberally interspersed with interesting stories to keep the narrative alive. However, to paraphrase Charles Dickens, the interest we find in reading these anecdotes is not the sort of interest that credits humanity. Instead, it is the interest in the macabre and the horrific that keeps us reading through Bell's list of atrocities, starting with Vendée and continuing into the Peninsula Wars. But there's a point to this, right? It's not just like you're reading Stephen King or reading the warped mind of some twisted guy. Not that I think Stephen King is twisted, I'm a fan. But this is the actual record of human history. This is what actually happened. And what's more, this is what actually happened in wars that were supposedly fought for humane and enlightened reasons. So this is something that we've got to deal with, is how these Enlightenment ideas led to these horrific events. Now, the book was published during the Iraq War. So I've been reviewing a number of history books published during the Iraq War recently. It does highlight the parallels between what was going on in the Revolutionary Wars and the mess we find ourselves in today. For example, Bell retells the debate in the French National Assembly concerning whether or not to invade neighboring countries and impose republican governments on them by force. Now, Robespierre, who's got a reputation for being a terrible tyrant near the end of his life, and he was. But Robespierre, to his credit at this stage in his career, was the voice of reason. Robespierre opposed the war, and Bell writes that Robespierre showed a better grasp of some basic principles of political sociology than have some more recent democratic leaders, and his words are worth quoting. The most extravagant idea that can arise in a politician's head is to believe that it is enough for a people to invade a foreign country to make it adapt their laws and their constitutions. No one loves armed missionaries. So that's Robespierre as quoted by David Bell on page 118 of this book. And I think that is so true for what it's worth. Then he goes into the Peninsular Wars. Now, I've just recently reviewed Napoleon's Egypt by Juan Cole, in which Juan Cole used Napoleon's failed expedition in Egypt as a parallel to the Iraq War. David Bell, however, takes Napoleon's failed expedition into Spain as his parallel for the Iraq War. Bell often compares the guerrilla war in Spain to Iraq. For example, quote, in particular, Spain saw the development of a guerrilla war every bit as destructive and eerily similar to the insurgency now underway in early 21st century Iraq. End quote. That's from page 70 of this book, but that's actually just one of several instances in which Bell makes a direct comparison between the Peninsular Wars in Spain and the Iraq War under Bush. Bell makes reference to the George Bush administration many times. He never mentions what to me is Bush's most infamous Orwellian quote, which is, quoting George Bush, "When we talk about war, we're really talking about peace." Bell doesn't mention that, although in my opinion that would fit his thesis perfectly, because his whole thesis is, in the modern world, we have a tendency to wage wars in the name of the ultimate peace. However, in his concluding chapter, Bell makes clear that he's very concerned about the use of language, which seeks to form every new war as a conflict between good and evil. Quote, "The survival of a belief in redemptive war has not yet, thankfully, led to a resumption of real war on an apocalyptic scale. It is only the language that is apocalyptic, for now. But as I have tried to show in this book, language matters." That's quoting from Bell on page 316 of this book.